We begin tonight with a question that historians would prefer you never ask. You sit in museums around the world, looking at artifacts sealed behind glass pottery, tools, sculptures, and something feels wrong. Not with the objects themselves, but with the story you're being told about them. The placard reads, circa 2000 BCE, Indus Valley civilization. But if you look closely at the precision of the craftsmanship, the sophistication of the urban planning documented in photographs, the mathematical precision encoded into their city layouts, you start to wonder, how did people without supposed advanced technology create this? And more pressingly, where did they go? This is not a new question, but it's a question that disappears the moment you leave the museum. History, as we've been taught it, follows a neat trajectory. Primitive humans discovered fire. They learned agriculture. They built villages, then cities. Progress was slow, incremental, inevitable. Each generation slightly more advanced than the last, like climbing a gentle slope toward the modern world we inhabit. It's a comfortable story. It makes sense. It feels earned. Except the evidence doesn't cooperate with this narrative. Walk through the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan, and you're standing in a city that was planned with geometric precision, streets laid out in perfect grids, sophisticated drainage systems, standardized weights and measures for trade. Walk through the remnants of ancient Egyptian monuments and observe the astronomical alignments so precise that modern astronomers are still studying them. Stand before Mayan astronomical records that tracked celestial movements with an accuracy that shouldn't have been possible without instruments we assume didn't exist. These civilizations didn't gradually develop sophistication. They appear in the archaeological record fully formed, as though someone had already worked out the difficult problems, and these cultures simply implemented the solutions. But here's where the mystery deepens. They vanished, not gradually, abruptly. The Indus Valley civilization flourished for 1,000 years, then within a few generations, the cities were abandoned. No signs of conquest, no evidence of famine in the traditional sense, no natural disaster obviously recorded. They simply stopped. The Mycenaean civilization in Greece underwent a similar collapse. Egypt's Old Kingdom ended with mysterious suddenness. The great cities of Mesoamerica were reclaimed by jungle within centuries. This isn't one anomaly. This is a pattern repeating itself across continents and cultures that had no contact with each other. What's remarkable is that this pattern appears consistent. Advanced civilization emerges. It flourishes for several centuries or millennia. Then it collapses completely, not gradually completely. The knowledge that built it seems to evaporate. The infrastructure crumbles. The people scatter. And then, after darkness, somewhere else, new civilizations begin again with similar sophistication, as though following some invisible blueprint. You're taught that this is coincidence, that civilizations independently discover the same solutions to the same problems. That collapse is simply what happens when societies become too complex. That the mystery you feel looking at these artifacts is just the natural awe of encountering human achievement. But what if you're feeling something more accurate than that? What if that sense that something is being hidden from you? What if that's actually correct? The next question becomes unavoidable. What if these aren't separate, isolated events? What if they're part of something larger? Let's step back and examine time itself as a framework. Not years measured on a calendar, but something deeper: geological time, the rhythm of ice ages, the pulse of our planet's climate. When you look at the historical record through this lens, something unexpected emerges. The dates align in ways that seem almost too precise to be random. Approximately 12,000 years ago, something fundamental shifted. The last ice age was ending. Massive ice sheets that had covered northern continents were collapsing. Sea levels were rising dramatically, not gradually over millennia, but in catastrophic surges. Geological records preserved in ice cores and sediment layers show this wasn't a gentle warming. It was violent, rapid. Civilization ending. And then, almost immediately after, within a few thousand years, humanity began building sophisticated societies once again. Agriculture appeared. Cities rose. Knowledge that shouldn't have existed yet, according to conventional timelines, suddenly materializes in the archaeological record. Now move forward 6,000 years from that point. 6,000 years a significant span, enough for an entire civilization to rise and flourish. And what do we find in geological records? Another marked shift. Environmental instability, climate volatility, records from ancient peoples describing catastrophe. Major civilizations experiencing stress continue this pattern forward. 4,000 years from the previous marker. Again, something happens. The Bronze Age collapses. Multiple advanced civilizations fail simultaneously: Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans. Not just one region, but across the Mediterranean and into Asia, as though a synchronized force triggered decline everywhere at once. Historians struggled to explain this for decades. How could unconnected civilizations collapse at the same moment with no common enemy identified? The conventional answers don't satisfy. Then 2,000 years before our present day, another marker, another period of upheaval and transformation. Empires decline, populations shift, knowledge fragments. The mathematical precision of these intervals is what matters. 12,000, 6,000, 4,000, 2,000. These numbers aren't arbitrary, they're not randomly distributed. They suggest rhythm, pattern, cycle. When you plot civilizational rises and collapses onto a timeline, you don't see chaos. You see waves, regular, recurring waves. Ancient peoples noticed this too. That's not superstition talking, that's documented fact. The Hindu texts describe cosmic ages called yugas, each lasting thousands of years, following a specific sequence of duration. The Babylonians tracked incredibly long astronomical cycles. The Egyptians oriented their greatest monuments toward the stars, with precision that suggests they were recording something far more significant than religious symbolism. They were mapping time, recording cycles, encoding knowledge about periodicity into stone and symbol. What if they were recording something real? What if the cycle wasn't imagined, but observed? What if ancient astronomers and scholars understood something about the rhythm of catastrophe that modern civilization forgot? Here's what makes this genuinely unsettling. If this 12,000-year pattern is real, and if our current civilization is approximately 12,000 years into its cycle, meaning we're approaching the point where the previous advanced civilization experienced catastrophe, then we need to ask ourselves a question that most people avoid. Where are we in this rhythm? Are we approaching another transition? Another reset? This isn't a prediction. It's an observation. The pattern exists in the historical record, documented in stone, in mythology, in geological evidence. Whether it continues or whether this cycle will be different, that remains to be seen. But the first step toward changing any pattern is acknowledging that the pattern exists. And it does exist. The evidence is there, if you're willing to look beyond what you've been taught and see what the evidence actually shows. What you're about to hear over the next several hours is not a conventional history lesson. It's an investigation. And like any genuine investigation, we're going to follow evidence wherever it leads. Even if it takes us into uncomfortable territory, into questions that academic institutions have largely avoided, into patterns that don't fit neatly into textbooks, into possibilities that challenge everything you've been told about how civilization actually works. The method we're using is simple. We're going to examine multiple disciplines: archaeology, geology, astronomy, mythology, and history. We're not going to cherry-pick evidence that supports a predetermined conclusion. Instead, we're going to observe what happens when we look at these different fields simultaneously and ask whether they're all pointing toward the same thing. When geologists find evidence of catastrophic climate change at regular intervals, and when archaeologists find evidence of civilizational collapse at those same intervals, and when ancient astronomers left records suggesting they were tracking something with cyclical periodicity, what does that convergence tell us? What we're investigating is this: human history isn't the story of linear progress you learned in school. It's something far more complex and far more cyclical. Civilizations don't just randomly collapse. They follow patterns. They rise, they advance, they develop sophistication and complexity, and then, with striking regularity, something happens that resets them. The question isn't whether this happens. The question is what causes it, and whether we can understand the mechanism before we experience it ourselves. This investigation will move through several phases. First, we're going to examine the previous world, the civilization that existed before our current era, and what happened to it. We're going to look at evidence that advanced societies existed before the catastrophe, that approximately 12,000 years ago reset human progress. We're going to examine myths from cultures that never contacted each other, all describing the same event. We're going to look at underwater structures and anomalous artifacts that suggest knowledge and capability that shouldn't have existed. Then we're going to trace how our current civilization began, not with primitive humans slowly inventing everything from scratch, but with survivors from the previous world deliberately seeding knowledge into the rebuilding process. We're going to examine the suspicious simultaneity of advanced knowledge appearing across multiple isolated civilizations, knowledge that served no practical purpose for survival, but served an enormous purpose for tracking and predicting cosmic cycles. From there, we'll examine why advanced civilizations collapse. We'll investigate the psychological and social mechanisms that lock civilizations into patterns that eventually destroy them. We'll look at how collapse doesn't just happen once, it happens repeatedly, at intervals so regular they suggest something more than coincidence. We'll explore the possibility that the cycle itself is the real history. Not just what happened, but the pattern of what keeps happening. We'll ask whether consciousness itself might be the variable that determines whether future cycles break the pattern or repeat it. And finally, we'll bring this back to you. In this moment, living in a civilization that's approaching a critical juncture in this 12,000-year rhythm. This isn't about fear, it's about clarity. Because the moment you see a pattern clearly, the moment you understand what's actually happening beneath the surface noise of daily news and political drama, something shifts. You can't unsee it. And that clarity, paradoxically, is where genuine power begins. So let's begin where all real investigations must, by going backward in time to see what the evidence actually shows us about civilizations that came before. Imagine stepping into an underwater cave off the coast of Portugal. You're descending beneath waves that crash against limestone cliffs, moving deeper into darkness illuminated only by your light. The walls around you become smoother, more regular. Your hand touches stone, and you feel something impossible. This isn't natural cave formation. These are carved walls, constructed chambers, a structure built by human hands submerged beneath the ocean. Dating analysis suggests this construction predates the floodwaters that rose at the end of the last ice age by several thousand years. This isn't speculation. This isn't pseudoscience whispered in dark corners of the internet. Underwater archaeology has documented similar structures in multiple locations, off the coast of Japan, the Mediterranean, Southeast Asia, and the Atlantic. Some remain controversial in academic circles. Others have been accepted by mainstream archaeology, but their implications are quietly avoided in textbooks. The question they raise is uncomfortable. If humans were building sophisticated structures tens of thousands of years ago, and if those structures are now underwater, what does that tell us about the timeline of human civilization? The conventional answer is that these are anomalies, outliers, mistakes in dating or interpretation. But anomalies are only anomalies if they're rare. When you find them repeatedly across different continents, at different depths corresponding to different sea level markers from different periods, the definition of anomaly starts to break down. Consider the precision of Egyptian monuments. The Great Pyramid's sides are aligned to magnetic north with a margin of error so small that it's almost impossible to believe it was achieved accidentally. The pyramid's dimensions encode mathematical relationships that shouldn't have been known to people in 2500 BCE. The internal architecture is so precise that modern construction engineers still study it, still ask questions about how it was built. Not whether it was impressive, obviously it was, but how it was constructed with the tools that supposedly existed at that time. The answers historians provide are unsatisfying. They speak of copper tools and ramps and thousands of workers, but the mathematics don't quite work. The efficiency suggested by the structure's existence implies planning and measurement capabilities that seem too advanced. Walk through the ruins of the Indus Valley civilization, and you find cities planned with mathematical precision. Standardized brick sizes, allowing perfect interlocking. Sewage systems that modern engineers recognize as sophisticated. Urban planning that suggests understanding of population flow and resource distribution. These cities appeared fully formed in the archaeological record. We don't find earlier, less sophisticated versions. We find them complete, as though the entire system was implemented at once. These aren't the only anomalies. There's the question of astronomical knowledge. Ancient peoples tracked the precession of the equinoxes, a phenomenon that takes approximately 26,000 years to complete a cycle. This motion is barely perceptible without advanced observation over centuries. Yet ancient mythologies reference it consistently. How could people without telescopes know about this? The conventional answer is that it's coincidence, or that they somehow independently discovered it through careful observation. But the precision with which it appears in mythology, from cultures separated by oceans, suggests something different. Then there are the myths themselves. From Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, from ancient India to Aboriginal Australia, similar stories appear. A great flood, darkness lasting days, the sky opening, civilizations destroyed, survivors left to rebuild. Different cultures couldn't have shared these stories through normal means of contact. Yet they describe the same events with striking consistency. Not identical cultures interpret through their own frameworks, but fundamentally the same catastrophe. What if these myths are remembering something real? What if an advanced civilization did exist before the catastrophe that ended the Ice Age? What if the geological evidence we see the impact craters, the shocked minerals, the ash layers in ice cores? What if ancient peoples witnessed this? And what if the flood myths aren't primitive misinterpretations of natural disaster, but accurate collective memories of actual catastrophe, passed down through generations? The question becomes, what happened to this previous civilization? Not whether it existed, the evidence suggests it did, but what ended it so completely that its survivors' descendants eventually forgot it had ever existed at all. 12,800 years ago, the sky changed. We know this because the evidence is written in ice, in stone, and in the genetic markers of surviving populations. What happened in that brief window, perhaps a single night, perhaps several days, was so catastrophic that it reorganized the entire planet's climate system. The leading scientific hypothesis, once dismissed as fringe science and now gaining mainstream acceptance, is called the Younger Dryas Impact hypothesis. It proposes that one or more objects from space asteroids, comets, or fragments of a disintegrating comet struck Earth around 12,800 years ago. The impact wasn't necessarily in one location. Evidence suggests it may have been multiple impacts, or an airburst over northern continents. The result was immediate and devastating. Massive firestorms ignited across vast regions. Ash and particulates rose into the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight. Temperatures plummeted. The already fragile climate system that had been warming jerked violently into a 1,000-year cold period known as the Younger Dryas. The evidence for this is startling in its specificity. In Greenland ice cores drilled thousands of feet deep, scientists found a distinct layer of platinum, an element rare on Earth, but common in meteorites. Just above and below this layer, evidence of massive firestorms. In North American sediment, similar platinum anomalies. Shocked quartz mineral crystals, fractured by extreme pressure, appears in layers that correspond to this time period. These aren't anecdotal observations. They're physical, measurable evidence preserved in the Earth itself. What did this do to human civilization? If advanced societies existed at that time, if they had built cities and trading networks and accumulated knowledge, the catastrophe would have been extinction level. Agricultural systems collapsed immediately, trade routes severed, communications networks between distant civilizations broken. Surviving populations faced starvation, displacement, and social chaos. The infrastructure that supported complexity, the surplus production, the specialization of labor, the transmission of knowledge, all of it crumbled within months. Ancient people understood something about this catastrophe that modern humans have largely forgotten. They recorded it. They encoded it into their most sacred myths. The Bible describes a flood that covered the earth and killed all life except what was preserved in an ark. Mesopotamian texts describe similar deluge. Hindu texts describe the end of an age. Mayan codices reference celestial events and destruction. Aboriginal Australian traditions speak of the time when the sky fell and the world was remade. These aren't coincidences, these are memories. Collective trauma preserved through mythology. But here's what's most important. The catastrophe didn't kill everyone. It couldn't have, because humans obviously survived. Small populations persisted, some in caves, some in regions isolated from the worst of the climate disruption, some possibly in underground structures we haven't discovered. And they possessed knowledge. Not all of it much was lost, but some of the most crucial information about astronomy, about cycles, about how to prepare for future catastrophes, somehow survived in those populations. The question becomes, did this knowledge survive by accident or by design? Did ancient people understand what was coming? Did the survivors who possessed crucial information deliberately preserve it, guard it, pass it down through secret channels and encoded symbols? Or was it luck? The answer to this question shapes everything that comes next, because in the darkness after catastrophe, certain knowledge becomes extraordinarily valuable. Knowledge of how to survive, knowledge of cycles, knowledge of what caused the catastrophe. And if you possessed that knowledge, and you wanted it to survive the darkness ahead, you would protect it. You would encode it into symbols that would survive when written language didn't. You would embed it into architecture that would stand when cities fell. You would preserve it through oral tradition, guarded by small groups who understood its importance. This knowledge, preserved and transmitted, would become the foundation for the next civilization that rose from the ashes. In the immediate aftermath of catastrophe, when the sky finally cleared and survivors emerged to assess what remained, certain individuals possessed something invaluable. Not tools, not supplies, not even physical strength. They possessed memory. They remembered how things were built. They understood mathematics and astronomy. They knew about agriculture and construction techniques that had been perfected over centuries. Most of this knowledge died with the billions who didn't survive. But fragments persisted in the minds of the learned, the priests, the builders, the astronomers who occupied special positions in pre-catastrophe societies. These survivors faced a choice. They could let the knowledge die with their generation, let humanity rebuild from absolute scratch. Or they could do something more complex. They could encode the knowledge into forms that would survive collapse and be rediscovered later. They could hide it in plain sight, embedded into stories that would be told and retold, into symbols that would be carved into stone, into architecture that future people would see and eventually understand. Consider Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey. It's a temple complex built approximately 9,600 years before the present, immediately after the catastrophe ended. This structure shouldn't exist according to conventional timelines. We believe agriculture didn't develop until several thousand years later. Yet Göbekli Tepe shows sophisticated stone working, careful astronomical alignment, and organization suggesting elaborate planning. Not primitive attempts at building, sophisticated construction from the beginning. As though someone who already understood engineering principles came to this location, set up markers and monuments, and then left, or as though this was a deliberate attempt to preserve knowledge in physical form. The same pattern appears across the post-catastrophe world. Stonehenge in Britain, astronomical precision, built and rebuilt over centuries, but the first version shows knowledge that shouldn't have existed. Mayan sites oriented to specific astronomical events. Egyptian temples built at specific latitudes, chosen deliberately for astronomical reasons. Not random choices, intentional placement. But more intriguing than the physical structures are the symbolic systems. Religious traditions emerging in post-catastrophe civilizations contain encoded astronomical knowledge. Hindu cosmology describes cosmic cycles with specific durations that, when examined mathematically, correspond to astronomical periods. Buddhist traditions describe similar cyclic time concepts. Mesoamerican calendars track astronomical events with precision that required centuries of observation, yet they're fully formed from the earliest records we have. Secret societies across history, from Freemasonry to Rosicrucianism, from mystery schools in Egypt to esoteric traditions in Asia, all carry a common feature. They encode astronomical and architectural knowledge in symbols and rituals. Not for mystical purposes, though that's how they're commonly understood. The symbols serve as a transmission system. They preserve knowledge across generations in a format that survives when institutional systems collapse. If you're initiated into the society, you learn not just rituals, but information. Information about cycles, information about how to observe the heavens, information about how to construct structures that embody astronomical principles. Why preserve knowledge this way? Why hide it in symbols and secret orders rather than simply teaching it openly? Because catastrophe destroys institutional systems. Libraries burn. Universities are abandoned. But symbols survive. Stories survive. Rituals persist when bureaucracies crumble. If you wanted crucial knowledge to survive the next catastrophe, you would encode it in these forms. This theory becomes more compelling when you ask, who would do this? Who would possess the foresight to say, we are experiencing a catastrophe so severe that civilization will completely collapse. Knowledge will be lost. People will forget. Therefore, I will spend my remaining years encoding information into symbols that my descendants, 7 generations from now, will not understand, but they will preserve nonetheless, and eventually, through study and awakening, they will rediscover what was lost. Only people who had experienced catastrophe before. Only people who remembered what could be lost. Only people who understood that the pattern might repeat. Only survivors who understood that civilization itself is cyclical, and that if knowledge is to persist through darkness, it must be encoded into forms that transcend the collapse of any single civilization. This is the inheritance we possess, not just physical artifacts and ruins, but symbols and stories and architectural principles encoded by people who understood something fundamental about how the world actually works. Around 10,000 years ago, something remarkable and coordinated happened across the globe. Not connected by communication, because communication networks had been severed by catastrophe centuries before. Not influenced by the same geographical advantages, because the beneficial locations were scattered across continents. Yet in Mesopotamia, in China, in Mesoamerica, in Africa, the same fundamental transformation occurred almost simultaneously. Agriculture emerged, not gradually over thousands of years of experimentation, as we might expect. It appeared almost fully formed. Domesticated crops that had been selected for their utility. Techniques for irrigation. Understanding of seasonal cycles and soil management. Conventional archaeology struggles with this. The gaps in the archaeological record suggest experimentation and gradual refinement should have taken thousands of years. Yet the evidence we have shows sophisticated agricultural systems in their first documented forms, not primitive attempts that improved over time. Effective systems from the beginning. It's as though someone or multiple groups of people possessed knowledge of agriculture already, and they simply implemented it in different locations. This coincidence of innovation across isolated civilizations repeats when you examine other technologies and knowledge systems. Mathematics appears in multiple cultures with similar sophistication. Writing systems develop with comparable complexity. Astronomical knowledge emerges. It's as though a blueprint existed, and different populations were implementing sections of it independently. But why agriculture? Why mathematics? Why specifically these technologies? For basic survival and tribal organization, these weren't strictly necessary. Humans had survived for millennia as hunter-gatherers. Agriculture is actually more labor-intensive and less secure than hunting and gathering, especially in the early stages. Yet suddenly, across the world, people were choosing to adopt it anyway. Unless they weren't choosing. Unless they were implementing a plan developed by survivors who understood something about the future. Agriculture allows for surplus production. Surplus allows for specialization. Specialization creates the foundation for complex civilization. Complex civilization allows for the accumulation and preservation of knowledge. Knowledge, passed down and accumulated, might be sufficient to prevent complete collapse when the next catastrophe arrives. This theory becomes less fantastic when you consider the psychological profile of the survivors who would have made these decisions. They lived through catastrophe. They watched civilization collapse. They understood what could be lost. If you believed catastrophe would repeat, and if you had evidence suggesting it might repeat on a regular cycle, you would make very different choices than people who believed history was linear. You would deliberately build systems designed to accumulate knowledge. You would create institutions to preserve information. You would work toward establishing complexity, because complexity allows for knowledge preservation in ways that small tribal societies cannot. The post-catastrophe world also shows evidence of intentional astronomical knowledge. Settlements are often located at specific latitudes, chosen seemingly for no practical reason, except that those latitudes provide certain astronomical perspectives. Religious traditions emphasizing cyclical time emerge early. Institutions begin forming to preserve and transmit knowledge across generations. Elites with access to restricted knowledge begin consolidating power. Within just a few thousand years of the catastrophe, humanity had rebuilt enough sophistication to establish recognizable civilizations. Not primitive societies slowly advancing toward civilization, but coordinated reconstructions of civilizational systems. In Egypt, organized religion and state structure emerged rapidly. In Mesopotamia, written records and urban centers appeared as if scripted. In the Indus Valley, cities were planned with mathematical precision from the beginning. Something guided this process. Not necessarily overtly not supernatural intervention or alien assistance, though some ancient traditions describe it that way, but the influence of survivors who possessed knowledge from before, the deliberate seeding of crucial information into rebuilding populations. The establishment of institutions designed to preserve and transmit that information. We call this civilization. We celebrate it as the triumph of human ingenuity, which it was. But it was also something else. It was the first attempt at implementing a system specifically designed to survive the next catastrophe. The first conscious effort to break the cycle. It would fail, but that failure would teach the lessons necessary for the next attempt. Between 5,000 and 3,000 years before the present, something unprecedented happened. Multiple advanced civilizations existed simultaneously across the globe, and evidence suggests they were in contact with each other in ways mainstream history has long obscured. Trade networks connected Egypt to distant Asia. Maritime routes moved goods and people. Information was exchanged. But more importantly, similar knowledge systems appeared independently, suggesting transfer of learning across cultures. The Great Pyramid of Giza embodies this sophistication. Its astronomical alignments are so precise that modern astronomers debate whether the precision was accidental or deliberately engineered. The pyramid incorporates mathematical relationships. The ratio of its height to its perimeter matches the ratio of Earth's radius to its circumference, a relationship that would have required sophisticated understanding of planetary geometry. The internal chambers align with specific star position. The structure itself becomes an astronomical instrument, a device for tracking celestial cycles. Similar sophistication appears across civilizations. The temples of Egypt show understanding of precession, that slow wobble in Earth's axis that completes a full cycle every 26,000 years. Ancient astronomical records from Babylon show tracking of planetary cycles with accuracy that required centuries of observation compressed into documents that appear to assume the observations were already known. The precision suggests that survivors from the previous civilization transmitted astronomical knowledge to the builders of new civilizations, not invented from scratch, transmitted, implemented, refined. What's remarkable is that this astronomical knowledge served no practical purpose for daily life. Tracking long-term celestial cycles doesn't help you grow crops or build irrigation systems. It doesn't make you more secure against enemies. Yet civilizations invested massive resources into astronomical observation and the construction of monuments aligned to celestial events. Why? Because they understood something. They knew, from the knowledge preserved in myths and symbols and the teachings of elders, that catastrophe returned on a schedule. That if you wanted to predict when the next catastrophe might arrive, you needed to understand celestial mechanics. You needed to track cycles. You needed to have continuous observations spanning generations so that patterns became visible. This knowledge formed the foundation of emerging religious and political systems. Priests who possessed astronomical knowledge gained tremendous power because they could predict celestial events. They could read meaning into the movements of stars and planets. They became intermediaries between the people and the cosmic forces that governed existence. Religious traditions crystallized around this knowledge, often encoding astronomical understanding into mythology and ritual. These civilizations also showed another peculiar characteristic. They seem to have been designed with redundancy. The Indus Valley civilization, for example, spread across a vast region with multiple urban centers. If the primary centers of knowledge were destroyed, secondary centers could preserve and transmit information. Egyptian temples preserved astronomical records in multiple locations. The distribution of knowledge prevented its complete loss if any single institution was destroyed. But more fascinating than the architecture of the civilizations was the architecture of the knowledge systems themselves. Secret societies formed, creating parallel institutions to official government structures. Mystery schools preserved esoteric knowledge. Priestly orders initiated students into sacred geometry and astronomical principles. These weren't mystical organizations, though they were understood that way by common people. They were knowledge preservation networks, designed to maintain crucial information across generations, even if official institutions fell. The irony is that this elaborate system for preserving knowledge during collapse was built into civilizations that believed themselves permanent. Kings commissioned monuments intended to last forever. They established dynasties expected to rule indefinitely. Yet underneath this assumption of permanence, parallel institutions prepared for catastrophe. This contradiction, planning for permanence while simultaneously building systems to survive collapse, suggests the elites of these civilizations understood something the common people didn't. They knew the pattern. They knew collapse was coming, and they were preparing. But preparation wasn't enough to prevent the collapse that followed. It only ensured that knowledge would survive to be rediscovered. History records several mysterious mass collapses of advanced civilizations, but two stand out as particularly puzzling: around 2200 BCE and again around 1200 BCE. These weren't gradual declines. They weren't due to military conquest by superior forces. They happened simultaneously across unconnected civilizations. The Bronze Age collapse, as historians call the later event, saw the fall of multiple empires: the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the New Kingdom of Egypt, and the disappearance of entire populations over roughly a century. It happened so rapidly that it seemed coordinated, yet no obvious coordinating force has ever been identified. What caused this? Military historians point to sea peoples, mysterious invaders whose origins remain unknown. But this explanation raises more questions than it answers. How could raiding populations, operating without unified command structure, coordinate simultaneous attacks on multiple well-defended empires across vast distances? Why did these coordinated invasions result in the collapse of multiple civilizations, rather than just military defeats that societies eventually recovered from? And why did the surviving populations abandon so much sophisticated knowledge? The preceding collapse, around 2200 BCE, shows similar patterns. The Old Kingdom of Egypt ended abruptly. Mesopotamian civilizations experienced simultaneous decline. Chinese dynasties transitioned to new ruling classes. Climate records suggest this period experienced unusual environmental stress. Droughts are documented, agricultural failures, famine. But climate stress alone doesn't explain why these civilizations collapsed so completely, why knowledge was abandoned, why the psychological and cultural damage seems so severe. There's something about these collapses that suggests they were experienced as apocalyptic by the survivors, not just as military defeats or economic crises, but as cosmic catastrophe. The mythologies that emerged after these periods reflect this. Stories of divine punishment, descriptions of celestial disturbances, narratives of civilization ending and being reborn. The trauma seems to have been profound enough that surviving populations rejected complexity as somehow dangerous or cursed. This is crucial to understanding the pattern. When civilizations collapse due to internal corruption or external military pressure, they typically attempt to rebuild similar systems. Empires fall and are replaced by new empires. But after these periodic collapses, there's often a complete rejection of the previous civilization's systems. People living in Rome's ruins didn't simply maintain what Romans built, they abandoned it. They allowed infrastructure to crumble. Knowledge that could have been preserved was actively forgotten. Why would survivors deliberately choose ignorance? The only explanation that makes psychological sense is trauma. These weren't just political or economic crises. They were experienced as cosmic catastrophes. Survivors were traumatized not just by what happened, but by the knowledge of what could happen. This trauma created psychological and cultural patterns that lasted for centuries. Rejection of complexity, preference for dispersed populations over cities, resistance to centralized knowledge systems. The survivors of Bronze Age collapse didn't just lose civilization, they deliberately refused to rebuild it immediately. They needed centuries to recover psychologically from what they'd experienced. But gradually, over generations, the pattern reasserted itself. Human populations grew, organization returned, knowledge began accumulating again. New civilizations formed, built on somewhat different foundations than the ones that collapsed, but ultimately following similar trajectories toward complexity. This is the cycle repeating itself. Emergence of advanced civilization, designed with knowledge preservation systems. Gradual development toward complexity and refinement. A period of confidence where the civilization believes itself permanent. Then, at some point that seems almost scheduled, something triggers collapse. Catastrophe, whether external or internal or both, overwhelms the system. The civilization falls. Survivors experience trauma. Knowledge is lost or deliberately forgotten. And then, after darkness, the cycle begins again. The question that becomes impossible to avoid is, are we living in the final stable phase of this cycle before the next collapse? And if so, what should we be doing with the knowledge we possess about what's coming? There's a moment in every civilization's decline when someone, usually a scholar, sometimes a political figure, recognizes what's happening. In Rome, it was historians like Ammianus Marcellinus, observing the empire's fragmentation in the 4th century. In Mayan civilization, astronomers and priests noted the ecological stress centuries before cities were abandoned. In the Indus Valley civilization's final centuries, we see evidence of abandonment and disorder in the archaeological record, suggesting people understood their systems were failing. These moments are documented. Ancient peoples left records of their own civilizations coming apart. They described the signs: moral decay, religious corruption, inequality widening, the wealthy growing more isolated, while common people suffered, institutions becoming rigid and unable to adapt. They watched their own systems fail and left written records of watching it happen. What's haunting is that despite recognizing the problem, they seemed unable to stop it. This isn't just historical observation. It's a pattern that repeats so consistently across cultures and centuries that it becomes predictive. Advanced civilizations begin with a burst of innovation and energy. There's flexibility, a wide distribution of knowledge and resources. Systems adapt quickly to challenges. But as civilizations mature, complexity increases. Power consolidates. The gap between elites and common populations widens. Knowledge becomes restricted to smaller and smaller groups. The system becomes brittle, less able to adapt, because change threatens the power structures that benefit from maintaining things as they are. Environmental stress accelerates the decline. When agriculture fails due to drought or climate shift, centralized systems often respond with restriction rather than adaptation. Resources are hoarded by elites. Trade networks, once flexible, become desperate competitions. Military spending increases. Border tensions emerge. The civilization that once directed resources toward building and knowledge now directs them toward military security. This shift is internally logical. If the system is threatened, defense seems paramount. But it accelerates collapse by diverting resources from the productive systems that sustain civilization in the first place. Population dynamics worsen the situation. In stable times, civilizations support higher populations through efficient resource distribution. But as efficiency declines, the population becomes a liability. Too many people dependent on systems that are failing. Too few resources to support them. The mathematics become brutal. Famine appears. Migration pressures increase. Social systems strain under the weight of managing desperate populations. Historical records from these periods describe horrific conditions. People eating the dead, selling children into slavery, abandoning cities. The psychological and social fabric tears apart. Here's what's most important to understand. Collapse doesn't happen because civilizations are stupid or primitive. It happens because civilizations are complex systems, and complex systems have structural vulnerabilities. The same hierarchical organization and specialization that allows a civilization to achieve great sophistication also creates dependencies. If the system breaks at critical junctures, everything downstream breaks too. A failure in agricultural systems creates food shortage, which creates political instability, which creates military conflict, which destroys the administrative capacity needed to manage the system, which cascades into complete breakdown. Most civilizations facing this situation have options. They could decentralize. They could reduce complexity voluntarily. They could share resources more equally to reduce social tension. They could invest in understanding and preventing collapse. Historical evidence suggests that civilizations rarely choose these options. Instead, they typically intensify existing patterns. Elites increase control rather than relinquishing it. Systems become more centralized rather than more distributed. Rigidity increases rather than flexibility. Why would civilizations continue down paths they recognize were leading to collapse? The answer lies in institutional psychology. Institutions optimize for their own survival, not for civilization's survival. A powerful general benefits from expanded military spending. A merchant class benefits from trade monopolies. Religious authorities benefit from maintaining orthodoxy. These groups control resources and decision-making. Change would threaten their position. So they resist change, even as the civilization dies around them. They're not acting irrationally from their perspective. They're simply optimizing for their own interests, within the constraints they perceive. The result is a civilization that accelerates toward collapse, because its institutions are structured to prevent the very changes that might prevent collapse. This is perhaps the deepest tragedy of the pattern. Civilizations contain the knowledge and capability to prevent their own collapse, but their institutional structures make using that knowledge almost impossible. Not all collapse is gradual. Some is sudden and catastrophic. A volcano erupts, and ash clouds darken the sky for months, dropping global temperatures and ruining agriculture worldwide. An asteroid strikes, or a comet passes close enough to disrupt Earth's magnetic field. A solar event floods Earth with radiation. These external triggers can collapse civilization in ways that internal stress alone cannot. Historical records document these events. In 535 CE, something catastrophic happened in Earth's atmosphere. Byzantine historians describe a year without summer. Chronicles from China, Persia, and Europe all record the same thing. Unexpected darkness, failed crops, widespread famine. No volcano was identified in historical records around that time, suggesting either a volcanic eruption that went undocumented or an atmospheric event from a different source. The year became known in historical literature as the Year of Darkness, or the Dust Veil event. Civilizations across the world experienced stress and crisis. Empires declined. Populations shifted. Religions changed. What caused it? Scientists still debate. But the meteorological records are clear. It happened. And the consequences were civilization-wide. More dramatic are impact events themselves. The Tunguska event of 1908 involved a relatively small asteroid, probably only about 20 meters across, exploding above Siberia. The explosion flattened 80 million trees across 2,000 square kilometers. If that impact had occurred over a populated region or a city, the death toll would have been catastrophic. If it had occurred over the ocean, it would have generated a tsunami. We exist in a solar system where such events happen regularly on geological timescales. The question isn't whether they happen. The question is when and where they next strike. Ancient peoples understood this in ways we've forgotten. They kept meticulous astronomical records. They tracked not just the visible planets and stars, but watched for unexpected celestial events. They built monuments aligned to astronomical positions. They created calendars tracking long cycles. This wasn't pure superstition or harmless astronomical curiosity. This was survival knowledge. They were watching the skies because they understood that threats came from the sky. The geological evidence confirms this understanding was justified. Earth has experienced multiple impacts throughout human history. During the Younger Dryas, approximately 12,800 years ago, the platinum anomalies and shocked quartz suggest multiple impacts or a massive airburst. But impacts and near misses have continued throughout human civilization. Evidence of a significant impact event around 2,300 years ago. Possible impact or near-impact events at other times. The impacts aren't rare aberrations. They're recurring events at intervals that remain somewhat predictable once you have enough data. What makes this relevant to understanding collapse is that external cosmic threats and internal civilizational stress can interact catastrophically. A civilization already strained by resource depletion and social fragmentation, hit with a sudden external shock-like crop failure from volcanic winter or direct impact, might collapse when it would have survived either threat alone. The interaction between internal vulnerability and external trigger determines whether crisis becomes catastrophe. Ancient mythologies describe celestial warfare, god battles, sky events. The language is metaphorical, but the events they're describing, darkness, raging destruction, celestial objects, sound remarkably like actual impact events or extreme volcanic scenarios. This isn't just imaginative storytelling. This is people attempting to describe genuine catastrophic events in the metaphorical language available to them. The deepest implication is this: catastrophe isn't random. It follows patterns. It arrives at intervals. And if you possess knowledge of those intervals and patterns, you could theoretically predict rough windows when such events become more likely. This would explain why ancient astronomers were so obsessed with tracking celestial cycles. They weren't indulging academic curiosity, they were tracking danger. They were watching for the next threat to arrive according to its probable schedule. When a civilization collapses due to combined internal stress and external catastrophe, the transition into darkness is remarkably rapid. Archaeological evidence shows this repeatedly. The great Mycenaean palaces of Greece didn't deteriorate gradually over centuries. They were abandoned within what appear to be years. Libraries in destroyed cities show evidence of fires so intense that clay tablets were fired hard, preserving their contents. Within a generation, literacy in the region disappeared almost completely. This isn't just loss of infrastructure or population decline. It's the active abandonment of knowledge systems. Surviving populations explicitly rejected the complexity that had characterized the previous civilization. In the centuries after the Bronze Age collapse, Greece experienced its Dark Age, a period where writing disappeared, architectural sophistication declined, population fragmented into isolated communities. This wasn't inevitable. People living in Greece after the collapse could have maintained Roman engineering knowledge, could have preserved written language. Archaeological evidence suggests they chose not to. Why would survivors deliberately abandon knowledge? The answer lies in psychological trauma. Collapse isn't just an economic or political event. It's an existential trauma. Survivors watch their entire world die. They experience starvation. They witness violence. They see institutions they trusted completely fail catastrophically. They watch knowledge that was supposed to be sacred and permanent become useless. Children born after collapse grow up in communities where the old knowledge is associated with failure and disaster. In these conditions, knowledge can become actively dangerous from a psychological perspective. The astronomy that the previous civilization prized, it failed to predict catastrophe. The engineering that built magnificent cities, those cities provided no protection when collapse came. The administrative systems that organized society, they collapsed into chaos. To survivors, the lesson wasn't, we need to preserve and improve this knowledge. The lesson was, this knowledge led to disaster. The adaptive response, from a trauma psychology perspective, was to reject it. This psychological trauma also manifests in mythology and religious practice. Religions that emerged after collapse often emphasized cyclical time, described disasters and renewals, and created rituals around preventing future catastrophe. They weren't arbitrary. They were systems designed by traumatized communities to prevent future collapse through compliance with perceived cosmic laws. If you didn't understand why collapse happened, but you'd survived it, the safest psychological stance was to assume it was punishment for violating sacred laws. The solution: stricter adherence to tradition, more ritual, more caution against change. This is how knowledge is actually lost. Not through destruction, though that happens too, but through deliberate rejection based on trauma-conditioned psychology. The communities that survived collapse and built new civilizations literally chose to forget, because remembering was psychologically unbearable. They chose simplicity over complexity, tradition over innovation, caution over ambition. Over centuries, this changes. New generations, not directly scarred by collapse, gradually reintroduce complexity. Agricultural sophistication increases, population grows, organization emerges. Knowledge begins accumulating again, but it's accumulated differently than before. It's encoded into religious practice, into secret societies, into myths and symbols that survive even when institutions fall. And as the new civilization matures, the cycle begins again. Sophistication increases, population grows, elites consolidate power, knowledge becomes restricted, environmental stress accumulates. The system becomes brittle, and inhabitants begin to experience the first faint warnings of a pattern they don't recognize, repeating itself once more across centuries. If you take the major events from human history and plot them on a timeline, something unexpected becomes visible. The catastrophes, the collapses, the mysterious, simultaneous failures of unconnected civilizations, they don't occur randomly. They cluster at intervals so consistent that a pattern emerges. Start with the most dramatic event, the Younger Dryas Impact, approximately 12,800 years ago. Mark it on your timeline. This was the catastrophe that reset the previous civilization completely. Now move forward 6,000 years. What do you find? Major environmental transitions, climate instability, evidence of stress on civilizations, mythology describing catastrophe and renewal. Not as dramatic as the Younger Dryas, but a significant transition point. Continue the pattern forward another 4,000 years. You arrive approximately 2,200 years before the present. And what does history show? Multiple advanced civilizations collapsing simultaneously, Egypt's old kingdom ending, Mesopotamian states fragmenting, evidence of environmental crisis. This collapse, called the 4.2 kiloyear event by climate scientists, affected civilizations worldwide. Archaeological evidence shows simultaneous abandonment of settlements across continents. It wasn't as apocalyptic as the Younger Dryas, but it was severe enough to reset multiple civilizations. Move forward another 2,000 years. You arrive at approximately 200 years before the present, actually, in ancient times, around 200 BCE. Again, transitions occur. Civilizations reorganize, dynasties change, political systems shift. Not as dramatic as the earlier collapses, but noticeable in historical records. The mathematical precision of these intervals is striking. 12,000, 6,000, 4,000, 2,000. These aren't randomly distributed, they suggest rhythm, periodicity, a pulse to history. If you think of the 12,000-year interval as a fundamental frequency, the shorter intervals are harmonics overtones within the larger cycle. This pattern doesn't mean collapse occurs exactly on schedule like clockwork. Rather, it means that certain windows are more vulnerable. Within a 500-year window around these dates, collapse becomes more likely. The pattern isn't deterministic, but probabilistic. The odds shift, the vulnerability increases. What's fascinating is that multiple cycles operate simultaneously. The long 12,000-year cycle provides the master rhythm. The 6,000-year intermediate cycles create secondary rhythms. The 4,000 and 2,000-year cycles create even more frequent pulses. This creates a complex pattern similar to musical rhythm, not simple ticking, but layered patterns that reinforce and interfere with each other. Ancient peoples clearly understood something about this. The Hindu concept of yugas describes ages lasting thousands of years each, following a specific sequence. The Babylonians tracked the Sar, a period of 3,600 years, which they considered cosmically significant. Various traditions reference the Great Year or cosmic cycles. These weren't arbitrary numbers. They appear to represent genuine understanding of periodicity. Interestingly, different civilizations seem to experience their individual collapses at different moments relative to the global cycle. Egypt might collapse earlier in a downturn, while another civilization collapses later. But the overall pattern of ups and downs repeats with consistency. It's as though there's a global rhythm, but local variations in how and when individual civilizations experience it. What causes this rhythm? The immediate triggers seem to vary. Sometimes climate change, sometimes military pressure, sometimes internal corruption. But beneath the varying triggers, something more fundamental appears to be happening. Something that creates windows of increased instability at regular intervals. Something that makes civilization more vulnerable at certain times and more resilient at others. The most reasonable hypothesis, based on available evidence, involves astronomical cycles. Earth's orbit experiences perturbations from gravitational influences of other planets and possibly undiscovered bodies in the solar system. These perturbations might create windows of increased asteroid impact risk or solar activity. They might trigger volcanic activity through changed crustal stresses. They might affect Earth's magnetic field. Any of these would increase civilizational vulnerability during those windows. But here's what matters most. If the cycles are real and periodic, and if our current civilization is approximately 12,000 years into its cycle, then we're approaching the end of that cycle. Whether that means catastrophe is imminent, or whether it means we're entering a more vulnerable window depends on how you interpret the data. But the data itself is clear. We're not in a random moment of history. We're at a specific point in a repeating pattern that has consequences. The question that emerges from recognizing the cycle is inevitable. What causes it? What's the mechanism that creates this rhythm? Is it external, coming from the cosmos? Or is it something internal to Earth systems? Or is it some combination of factors that interact? The evidence suggests the answer might be more complex than any single explanation. But the astronomical evidence is particularly compelling. Earth's solar system is not a static arrangement. The planets move. Their orbits shift slightly due to gravitational interactions. Over long periods, thousands and millions of years, these variations create patterns. One well-understood pattern is precession. Earth's axis wobbles like a spinning top winding down, completing a full cycle every 26,000 years. This isn't modern discovery. Ancient peoples recognized precession and incorporated it into their calendars and mythologies. The significance is that as Earth's axis changes orientation, our planet's relationship to cosmic radiation and solar cycles shifts. Another relevant cycle involves Earth's orbital eccentricity, how elliptical our orbit around the Sun becomes. This varies over periods of roughly 100,000 years. When Earth's orbit is more elliptical, we experience greater variation in solar heating between perihelion and aphelion. This affects climate patterns. Climate stress can trigger civilizational stress. But there's something even more significant that astronomers have increasingly come to recognize. The solar system appears to move through different regions of the galactic plane. As our Sun orbits the galactic center, a journey taking roughly 225 million years, it passes through regions of space with different densities of dust, cosmic rays, and perhaps other hazards. Some of these regions might be more dangerous than others. Additionally, and most relevant to the 12,000-year cycle, evidence suggests that the solar system might encounter clouds of dust, asteroids, or fragments from disintegrating comets at somewhat regular intervals. These encounters would dramatically increase impact risk. The Oort cloud, a spherical shell of icy bodies surrounding the solar system at vast distance, occasionally showers Earth with comets when perturbed by passing stars or other gravitational influences. Some theoretical models suggest this perturbation might happen at intervals related to cosmic resonances. The Nemesis hypothesis, once dismissed as fringe science, proposed that the Sun might have an undiscovered companion star that periodically disturbs the Oort cloud, triggering comet showers. While the hypothesis hasn't been confirmed, it illustrates how seriously astronomers take the possibility of periodic cosmic threat. More recent work suggests that perturbation might come from other stars passing near the Sun, or from the solar system's movement through denser regions of the galaxy. What matters is that the mechanism is plausible. Periodic increases in impact risk are not scientifically absurd. They're predicted by models of how solar systems behave over vast timescales. And if impact risk increases periodically, and if impacts trigger environmental catastrophe capable of collapsing civilizations, then the 12,000-year cycle becomes explicable through purely astronomical and geological mechanisms. But here's where it gets more interesting. If the cycle exists and is somewhat predictable, ancient peoples could have theoretically observed it. Multiple impacts or near misses separated by thousands of years would establish a pattern. careful astronomical observation across generations could reveal the periodicity. This might explain the obsessive astronomical record-keeping of ancient civilizations. They weren't keeping records for their own satisfaction. They were tracking danger. They were measuring the intervals between catastrophes. They were attempting to predict when the next catastrophe might arrive. From this perspective, the pyramids and temples and monuments aligned to celestial positions aren't primarily religious structures. They're astronomical observation posts. Permanent installations designed to continue tracking celestial cycles even after the civilization that built them collapsed. The knowledge encoded into their alignments would survive as physical fact, waiting for future peoples to rediscover it. This leads to a profound realization. If catastrophe is periodic and somewhat predictable, then the question becomes not whether it will happen, but whether we will be prepared when it does. And whether preparing for catastrophe means we can prevent it, mitigate it, or at least survive it more gracefully than previous civilizations did. There's a category of evidence that mainstream academia largely ignores, but that becomes crucial when you understand the cycles. Evidence suggesting that certain civilizations were deliberately designed with catastrophe in mind, not consciously for most participants, but at the level of those who possessed crucial knowledge and influence. Consider the geographic distribution of knowledge centers in ancient Egypt. The temples weren't randomly located. They were placed at specific latitudes and longitudes, chosen seemingly for no practical reason, except that these locations provided optimal astronomical perspectives for observing certain celestial events. This required either extraordinary coincidence across multiple independent temple-building decisions, or centralized planning by someone who understood the location's significance. In Mesoamerica, the Mayan cities show similar patterns, located at positions that provided specific astronomical advantages, oriented to celestial events, built with architectural features designed to track astronomical cycles. The Mayan long-count calendar tracked astronomical and temporal cycles over periods of thousands of years. Not years, thousands of years. Why would a culture invest in tracking timescales that vastly exceeded any individual's lifespan, or even the expected duration of their civilization, unless they understood that this knowledge needed to survive across multiple civilizations? Unless they were encoding information that needed to persist through collapse. More intriguingly, many of these ancient knowledge systems encoded information redundantly, multiple pathways to the same knowledge. If you didn't understand the astronomical alignments of temples, you might learn about cycles through mythology. If you didn't know the myths, you might eventually decode the information from architectural proportions. If you didn't understand the architecture, the information persisted in religious practices and rituals. Knowledge was encoded in multiple formats, increasing the likelihood that at least some would survive catastrophe and be rediscovered later. Secret societies and mystery schools further distributed and preserved knowledge. These organizations weren't conspiratorial in the modern sense. They served a practical function. They maintained knowledge across generations through initiated teaching. Members swore oaths to preserve certain information. Rituals encoded astronomical and geometric principles. Symbols carried meanings that only initiates understood. This system had advantages for knowledge preservation. If an institution was destroyed, the knowledge survived in the minds of dispersed individuals who had been trained to preserve it. The most sophisticated form of this architecture is what might be called time-released information. Knowledge encoded into symbols or stories that could be understood at different levels by different people at different times. A religious story might serve devotional purposes for common believers, but convey technical astronomical information to those trained to read it at that level. Geometric patterns might appear purely decorative to casual observers, but encode mathematical relationships to those who understood the proportions. All of this suggests intentional design at a deep level. Not necessarily planned by a single conspiracy, but rather by survivors of previous catastrophe who understood something fundamental about how knowledge persists. They understood that catastrophe destroys institutions. Therefore, knowledge preserved in institutions alone would be lost. But knowledge encoded into multiple formats, physical structures, mythology, ritual, symbols, geometric patterns, could survive even if specific institutions failed. Knowledge, distributed among initiated individuals, would survive better than knowledge concentrated in libraries or temples. Information that remained meaningful at multiple levels of understanding would be preserved better than information requiring technical expertise to interpret. In essence, these ancient civilizations created redundant, distributed, multi-format knowledge preservation systems. Not because they were paranoid, but because they understood the stakes. They had inherited knowledge of what could be lost. They had seen civilizations collapse and knowledge die with them. They determined to prevent that from happening again. Whether they succeeded is still being written. Some of their knowledge has survived, encoded in symbols we're only beginning to understand, preserved in myths we're learning to read accurately, embedded in architectural dimensions we're finally studying with proper attention. Some knowledge was lost completely. But the attempt was made. The architecture was built. The design was implemented. And now, positioned at a similar critical point in our own civilization's cycle, we're beginning to recognize what was built and why it was built. We're starting to understand the message that was left for us. Pay attention to cycles. Knowledge is fragile. Prepare for transition. Nothing lasts forever, but the learning that flows through civilizations can persist if you encode it properly. There exists a peculiar phenomenon in complex systems. They accelerate toward critical points. In the moments before collapse, the velocity of change increases. Instabilities emerge faster. Problems compound more rapidly. Patterns that had been manageable for centuries suddenly become unmanageable within years. Scientists studying this phenomenon have developed mathematical models. The systems aren't random. They follow predictable patterns as they approach phase transitions. Our civilization is accelerating by virtually every meaningful measure. The speed of change, the emergence of new problems, and the interconnectedness of crises are all increasing exponentially. Not linearly, exponentially. Information technology is becoming more advanced, not gradually, but in rapid cascades. Environmental stress is increasing. Social polarization is intensifying. Resource constraints are tightening. The mathematical models that describe systems approaching critical points accurately describe our current moment. This acceleration itself is significant because it mirrors what happened in previous civilizations immediately before they collapsed. Rome in the 3rd century CE experienced accelerating institutional breakdown. Multiple emperors ruled in quick succession. Military crises multiplied. Economic inflation escalated. Environmental problems worsened. The system was fragmenting faster and faster until the fragmentation became irreversible. Surviving Romans at that time described feeling that everything was collapsing simultaneously. That feeling wasn't subjective despair. It was accurate perception of genuine acceleration. Similarly, Mayan civilization in the 9th century CE experienced accelerating crisis. Droughts worsened. Agricultural systems failed. Cities that had thrived for centuries were abandoned in decades. The rate of collapse increased as the system broke. Surviving records suggest that Mayan elites recognized the crisis but were unable to coordinate responses. Individual cities attempted to solve local problems through military conquest, which exacerbated the larger system collapse. The attempts to save the system actually accelerated its destruction. Our current situation shows parallels. Political systems that were resilient for centuries are now fragmenting rapidly. Institutions that once seemed permanent are destabilizing. Global systems designed to manage resources and trade are experiencing strain. Most importantly, proposed solutions to major crises often generate secondary crises. Military interventions destabilize regions. Economic stimulus generates inflation. Immigration restrictions create humanitarian crises. The attempts to solve individual problems compound the larger instability. Additionally, our civilization exhibits all the psychological patterns that preceded previous collapses. Extreme wealth inequality creates social tension and reduces the likelihood that elites will cooperate on solutions that threaten their power. Short-term thinking dominates institutions' quarterly earnings reports for corporations. Election cycles for governments making long-term coordinated planning nearly impossible. Knowledge fragmentation means that crucial information remains siloed within specialized disciplines. The person studying climate systems doesn't communicate with the person studying social collapse mechanisms. The person designing financial systems doesn't coordinate with the person understanding ecological constraints. Most significantly, denial characterizes responses to warning signs. Despite overwhelming evidence, significant portions of populations deny climate change. Despite clear indicators of inequality's destabilizing effects, policies often increase inequality. Despite documented failures of military interventions, military spending continues increasing. This isn't accidental. It's systematic denial driven by institutional incentives. Those who benefit from current systems resist change even as the system destabilizes. What's haunting is that some of our most sophisticated people understand this. Climate scientists understand the trajectory. Economists model system fragility. Psychologists study denial. Military strategists game out collapse scenarios. This knowledge exists. It's published in peer-reviewed journals. It's available to decision-makers. Yet institutional structures prevent this knowledge from translating into coherent response. The system is designed to optimize for short-term stability of existing power structures, not for long-term civilization survival. We're positioned, in other words, precisely where previous civilizations were positioned immediately before collapse. All the warning signs are present. Most of them have been present for decades. The difference is that we can see them clearly. We can read history. We can recognize the pattern. And yet the system continues accelerating toward collapse precisely as the pattern predicts. This creates an extraordinary moment. We have knowledge that previous civilizations lacked. The question isn't whether we can see the pattern. We can. The question is whether seeing the pattern is enough to change it. If catastrophe is cyclical and approximately 12,000-year periodic, then the mathematical answer to how long until the next major reset is roughly 8,000 years into our current cycle, with approximately 4,000 years remaining before the major cycle completes. By this calculation, we're not approaching the apocalyptic endpoint imminently. We should have thousands of years of relative stability ahead. But this calculation assumes we're measuring from the right point. The previous major catastrophe occurred approximately 12,800 years ago. Our current civilization began rebuilding approximately 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. But civilization as a recognizable social form with cities, writing, complex institutions is only about 5,000 to 6,000 years old. If the cycle measures from when the previous civilization began rather than when it catastrophically ended, then we might be at a different point than traditional calculations suggest. Additionally, shorter cycles appear to operate within the larger framework. The 6,000-year intermediate cycle, the 4,000-year cycle, and the 2,000-year cycle all seem to create windows of increased vulnerability. If we count from the younger Dryas catastrophe, we're potentially approaching a 4,000-year cycle completion, approximately now. Not the major 12,000-year reset, but a significant intermediate transition. These intermediate transitions don't typically trigger apocalyptic catastrophe, but they do create periods of increased instability lasting centuries or sometimes decades. This might actually be more concerning than the larger timeline. An apocalyptic extinction-level event 4,000 years in the future is distant enough that current populations feel no urgency. But a transition period beginning now, or within the next few centuries, creates immediate relevance. A transition period would create intensified environmental stress, increased social instability, potential for military conflict, and the breakdown of complex systems, not because of a single catastrophic event, but because of accumulated stress and triggering events interacting with a system that's already approaching critical points. Climate science provides additional timing information. Current warming trends and their projected consequences suggest that within 50 to 200 years, our civilization will face unprecedented environmental stress. Agricultural systems will struggle. Coastal populations will face flooding. Refugee crises will intensify. Resource conflicts will proliferate. These aren't speculative worst-case scenarios from fringe scientists. These are mainstream projections from climate researchers with decades of data. Military scenarios add another timing dimension. Geopolitical tensions are increasing. Nuclear powers are modernizing arsenals. Cyber warfare capabilities are expanding. The possibility of catastrophic warfare, which could trigger civilizational collapse, regardless of environmental factors, is higher now than in recent decades. The probability of global military conflict in the next 50 years is estimated by serious strategists as substantially higher than zero. The convergence of these timelines is what matters. We don't need to wait for a cosmic impact to experience collapse. We don't need to wait for a single apocalyptic event. We need only for multiple stresses, environmental, military, economic, social, to interact catastrophically. And the timing for such interaction could be measured in decades rather than millennia. This is actually consistent with the cyclical theory. The cycle doesn't guarantee that catastrophe will arrive on a specific date. Rather, it creates windows of increased probability. Within that window, various stresses can trigger cascade failures. The window might be narrow or broad. The triggering event might be external or internal. But within the window, the system is vulnerable in ways it's not during other periods. By this interpretation, we're currently in or approaching a high vulnerability window. The short-term cycles are aligning with long-term deterioration. Multiple stresses are simultaneously increasing. The system is accelerating. And if a significant triggering event occurs, military conflict, major pandemic, ecological disruption, the system's response might cascade into civilizational collapse. This timing is also why awareness becomes significant right now. If the vulnerable window is decades to centuries long, then actions taken in this period could potentially mitigate cascading failure. We have time to build resilience, to distribute knowledge systems, to create redundancy in critical infrastructure, to prepare. But that window isn't infinite. Within a few centuries, if nothing changes, the window closes and collapse becomes nearly inevitable. The question that emerges from this analysis is whether the pattern is truly deterministic. Is collapse inevitable, or can awareness and preparation change the trajectory? This is perhaps the most important question to address, because the answer determines what actions make sense. The theoretical answer is optimistic. Awareness is transformative. A civilization that understands its cyclical nature would make different choices than one that believes history is linear or random. It would build systems designed to survive disruption. It would preserve knowledge in redundant formats. It would prioritize long-term stability over short-term advantage. It would prepare. But theoretical possibility doesn't guarantee practical outcome. Throughout history, despite having access to historical examples and warnings about collapse, civilizations continued accelerating toward their own destruction. The knowledge that collapse was possible didn't prevent it. Why would our knowledge be different? One possibility: previous civilizations didn't have the knowledge we have. They understood collapse was possible through mythological memory or philosophical speculation, but they didn't understand the mechanisms. They couldn't model the cascading failures. They couldn't see the patterns with mathematical precision. They couldn't access the global information networks that allow us to recognize that what we're experiencing is part of a repeating pattern. They had wisdom, but not comprehensive systems understanding. We have both. We can model system behavior. We can understand complexity theory. We can see the patterns emerging globally in real time. We can predict cascade failures. We can identify intervention points where small changes might prevent large collapses. This comprehensiveness is genuinely new. Additionally, we have technologies that could theoretically sustain complexity through disruption in ways previous civilizations couldn't. Distributed information systems could preserve knowledge even if centralized institutions fail. Renewable energy systems could continue functioning even if trade networks collapse. Agricultural techniques developed in one region could be rapidly transmitted globally. These aren't guarantees technology is neutral and can be deployed toward either resilience or fragility. But the possibility exists. Perhaps most importantly, we have sufficient time. The vulnerable window might be measured in decades or centuries, but it's not tomorrow. We have time to make conscious choices about what systems we build, what knowledge we preserve, what structures we implement. We have time to transition toward greater resilience if we choose to do so. The challenge is that making this choice requires overcoming enormous institutional resistance. The systems benefiting from current arrangements will resist change. Short-term thinking dominates institutions. Psychological denial prevents recognition of threats. Fragmentation of knowledge prevents coordinated response. These are real barriers, not minor inconveniences. But they're not absolute barriers. Throughout history, major transitions have occurred when sufficient numbers of people recognized that change was necessary. Industrial civilizations emerged because enough people understood that industrial systems offered advantages worth the disruption of agricultural systems. Environmental movements emerged because enough people recognized environmental destruction was unacceptable. Institutional changes have occurred when sufficient critical mass demanded them. The possibility exists, therefore, that our civilization could intentionally transition toward greater resilience. We could voluntarily choose lower material consumption in exchange for greater stability. We could decentralize knowledge and power. We could build redundancy into critical systems. We could create buffer capacity rather than optimizing for just-in-time efficiency. We could invest in long-term survival rather than maximizing quarterly returns. Whether we will make these choices is unknown. Whether making these choices would prevent collapse or merely slow it is also uncertain. But the possibility exists, and the mere existence of possibility is remarkable. Previous civilizations didn't have this choice. They couldn't see the pattern clearly enough to deliberately intervene. We can. This is the gift and the burden of our moment. We can see. And seeing, we must choose. The choice between continuing current patterns knowing where they lead, or consciously attempting something different. The choice isn't easy, but it's real, and it matters. Human psychology contains a feature that evolutionary biologists have long puzzled over: the capacity for believing things that contradict available evidence. Not irrationality exactly, it's something more systematic. It's called normalcy bias, and it operates at both individual and collective levels. The premise is simple. People assume that tomorrow will resemble today, that patterns will continue. That catastrophe won't happen because catastrophe hasn't happened recently. This bias served us well in ancestral environments. If things had been dangerous, you wouldn't be alive to inherit that skepticism. But in complex civilizations, normalcy bias becomes dangerous. Imagine being a Roman citizen in 250 CE. You've heard stories about barbarians at the borders, but Rome has existed for 5 centuries. Your great-great-grandfather heard the same stories. Nothing happened then. Why should you believe catastrophe will happen now? The psychological impulse is strong to discount warnings. This is rationality, from a certain perspective. You're using historical precedent. Rome has survived previous threats. Why not this one? The problem is that normalcy bias blinds you to genuine changes in conditions. The barbarian populations were indeed increasing. Roman military capacity was declining. The economic system was destabilizing. These weren't minor variations on historical norms. They were genuine changes in fundamental conditions. But acknowledging them would require abandoning the assumption that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. It would require action, sacrifice, risk. It's psychologically easier to continue assuming normality. Throughout history, populations facing collapse had access to warnings. Egyptian texts describe environmental stress centuries before Old Kingdom collapse. Mayan records show recognition of ecological crisis well before cities were abandoned. Roman historians documented the empire's fragmentation as it was happening. The knowledge existed. The warnings were present. Yet denial persisted, not because people were stupid, but because the human mind is designed to maintain existing models of reality as long as possible. Switching to a new model requires psychological work and carries risk. Institutions amplify this denial. A person might recognize personally that something is wrong, but institutions are designed to maintain existing structures and worldviews. A general needs the military budget to increase to deploy troops effectively, so he requests it. A merchant benefits from current trade arrangements, so she advocates maintaining them. A religious authority benefits from existing doctrine, so he defends it. All of them are acting rationally from their perspective. But collectively, these individual rational decisions prevent the system-wide changes that might prevent collapse. This is why civilizations continue accelerating toward collapse, even when some portion of the population recognizes what's happening. The structure of institutions makes coordinated response nearly impossible. Change threatens established power. Solutions that would work require decentralization and power sharing. Those holding power resist, and so the system continues degrading until collapse is inevitable. Our current civilization exhibits this same pattern. Climate scientists publish detailed warnings. Their research is available. Yet policies responding to climate change remain inadequate because responding at the scale necessary would threaten existing economic arrangements. Military strategists wargame collapse scenarios. Their reports circulate in think tanks, yet military spending continues increasing because it serves institutional interests. Psychologists understand denial mechanisms, yet this knowledge doesn't translate into systematic institutional change. The insight is this: collapse isn't prevented by knowledge or capability. Civilizations possess both. Collapse is prevented by the ability to overcome institutional resistance and psychological denial. And this requires something rarer than intelligence or resources. It requires coordinated action towards something that threatens existing power structures. Throughout history, this has proven nearly impossible to achieve. When catastrophe strikes a civilization, it doesn't simply destroy infrastructure and kill populations. It destroys something more fundamental: the shared psychological framework that holds societies together. People experience trauma so severe that its effects persist across generations. Survivors pass psychological patterns to their children and grandchildren. Trauma becomes encoded in culture. Psychological research on intergenerational trauma, developed initially to understand Holocaust survivor families, demonstrates that trauma affects not just individuals, but entire populations. Children born after catastrophic events show psychological patterns consistent with their parents' trauma, even though they didn't experience the events directly. Cultures that experienced severe collective trauma develop specific patterns: preference for social cohesion over individual expression, resistance to rapid change, emphasis on ritual and tradition as stabilizing forces, sometimes reluctance to accumulate complex knowledge systems. After civilizational collapse, survivors don't simply rebuild using the knowledge they possessed before catastrophe. They rebuild, but transformed by trauma. The psychological impact of having experienced complete system failure is profound. What had seemed permanent proved fragile. What had seemed safe proved dangerous. Institutions that should have protected you failed catastrophically. The natural psychological response is conservatism. Try again, but more carefully. Preserve tradition. Be suspicious of innovation. Build social structures emphasizing cohesion and stability. Don't attempt the ambitions that previous civilization attempted. They led to disaster. Keep things simple. Keep things safe. Maintain connection to the group. This psychological transformation becomes encoded into mythology and religion. The flood myths that appear across cultures aren't just recounting geological events. They're processing collective trauma. The emphasis in many religions on cyclical time, on ages and eons and renewals, isn't arbitrary philosophy. It's psychological management of trauma. It says, catastrophe happened before. It might happen again. This is the nature of existence. Prepare yourself psychologically for disruption. Additionally, traumatized populations often develop what might be called knowledge resistance. Not irrationality. Rational caution. The astronomical knowledge that pre-catastrophe civilization valued? It failed to predict or prevent catastrophe. Why invest in it again? The engineering principles that built magnificent cities. Those cities provided no protection. The administrative complexity that organized society? It collapsed into chaos when the system failed. To survivors, the lesson appears to be: complexity leads to disaster. Specialization creates vulnerability. Centralized knowledge fails. The solution: maintain local knowledge. Keep things simple. Preserve tried and true methods. Don't experiment with radical new approaches. Over centuries, this trauma response transforms. New generations who didn't experience the catastrophe grow up in communities where the old knowledge is simply absent. They don't inherit it with the trauma embedded. They might wonder why certain knowledge was abandoned, but rebuilding requires focus on immediate survival. Eventually, some of the old knowledge is reinvented or slowly reintroduced through trade or contact with other communities that preserved it differently. But the memory persists, encoded in mythology as warnings, embedded in ritual as protective practices, woven into religious doctrine as principles about cosmic balance and human obligation to the divine. What appears to later observers as primitive superstition was actually sophisticated psychological technology, developed by traumatized communities to manage their ongoing vulnerability to catastrophe. The most haunting aspect is that this psychological inheritance might persist across multiple cycles. If collapse creates trauma-based psychological patterns in survivors, and those survivors raise children, and those children raise grandchildren, the pattern persists. It becomes cultural inheritance. People in civilizations that came after previous collapses might carry psychological patterns originating from catastrophes their ancestors experienced thousands of years ago. Fear of change, preference for tradition, resistance to complexity. These might be the echoes of ancient trauma, still shaping behavior. After Rome fell, reconstruction didn't begin immediately. For roughly a century, surviving populations focused on subsistence. They scavenged materials from the ruins. They attempted to maintain some of the infrastructure that remained. They gradually adapted to a world where the supply lines that had fed cities no longer functioned. Urban populations relocated or died. People returned to agricultural existence. Literacy declined steeply. Complex institutions disappeared. Then, gradually, over centuries, rebuilding began. Not rapidly. The data shows that Rome's population took roughly 1,000 years to recover to near pre-collapse levels. But it recovered. Communities formed. Agricultural techniques improved. Trade routes re-established. Written language returned. By 700 or 800 CE, the structure of society had reformed into something recognizable as civilization, though vastly less complex than the Rome that had fallen. The question this raises is whether this constitutes genuine rebuilding, or simply the opening phase of a new cycle destined to repeat. Were the societies emerging in Europe and Asia after Rome's collapse truly restoring what was lost? Or were they simply starting again, implementing similar social structures that would inevitably lead towards similar collapse? The evidence suggests something in between. The post-Rome societies weren't resurrecting Roman civilization exactly. They created different structures. Feudalism, for example, was not Roman. The knowledge they possessed was partial. Some Roman engineering techniques were preserved through the Catholic Church's monastic system, but much was lost. Gradually, through contact with preserved Byzantine knowledge, and through local innovation, sophisticated civilization returned. But what's significant is that the rebuilding communities faced an enormous challenge. How do you maintain knowledge across a period when institutions have collapsed? If writing disappears, how is information preserved? If cities are abandoned, how is complex knowledge maintained? If specialization breaks down because trade networks are destroyed, how does the knowledge of specialists survive? The answer, historically, involved multiple mechanisms. Oral tradition preserved some knowledge in memory. Religious institutions in post-Roman Europe preserved written knowledge in monastic libraries. Some communities maintained craft knowledge through apprenticeship systems. Contact with communities that had preserved knowledge differently allowed cross-pollination of information. But inevitably, much was lost. Agricultural techniques were forgotten. Engineering principles vanished. Astronomical knowledge was preserved only in fragments, mostly within religious contexts. The loss wasn't total, but it was substantial. Rebuilding required reinvention of solutions that had already been solved before. This inefficiency meant that building back to pre-collapse complexity took centuries rather than decades. More importantly, the redevelopment didn't follow identical paths. Post-Rome Europe developed feudalism and eventually capitalism. Post-Islamic Golden Age societies developed different institutions. Different regions rebuilt differently because they possessed different fragments of preserved knowledge and faced different circumstances. The pattern of rise and complexity repeated, but the specifics differed. This suggests that while the cyclical pattern might be fundamental, civilizations do rise, develop complexity, and collapse. The exact forms they take within that pattern can vary. The cycle isn't perfectly deterministic. There are degrees of freedom. Choices about how to rebuild, what knowledge to preserve, what institutional structures to establish. These choices affect how the new civilization develops. From this perspective, the possibility of breaking the pattern becomes slightly more plausible, not by resisting the cycle entirely, that might be impossible, but by making different choices about what forms the civilization takes, by consciously building systems designed to survive collapse rather than optimizing only for growth, by distributing knowledge in ways that persist through disruption, by creating redundancy and resilience rather than efficiency and fragility. Whether we possess sufficient wisdom and coordination to make these choices remains uncertain. But the possibility exists, and that possibility is what differentiates our moment from all previous moments in human history. Beneath the Great Pyramid lies a passage that has never been fully explored. In 2017, thermal imaging revealed an enormous cavity behind the pyramid's walls, a void so large it defies conventional explanations for how it could have been created using the technology that supposedly existed at the time. The discovery raises questions about whether our understanding of ancient capability is incomplete, not because aliens built the pyramid, but because the engineering sophistication might exceed what we acknowledge. This isn't an isolated anomaly. Acoustic properties of certain ancient temples suggest they were designed as acoustic instruments, optimized for specific sound frequencies. The precision suggests knowledge of acoustics that shouldn't have been available to people with primitive instruments. The astronomical alignments of pyramid and temple complexes are so precise that they suggest sophisticated understanding of orbital mechanics. The mathematical proportions embedded into ancient architecture suggest knowledge of advanced mathematics. The conventional explanation is that we're reading too much into coincidence. The precision might be accidental. The acoustic properties might be unintended side effects of construction methods. The astronomical alignments might result from cultural significance of particular celestial events, rather than technical knowledge of orbital mechanics. But what if the conventional explanation is wrong? What if ancient peoples genuinely possessed knowledge that modern archaeology hasn't recognized? Not magical knowledge, nothing that violated physical laws, but sophisticated understanding of engineering, mathematics, acoustics, and astronomy that was eventually lost and had to be reinvented. There's a category of ancient texts describing technologies or phenomena that we're only now beginning to understand. The Vedas describe concepts that sound remarkably like aeronautical principles. Mesopotamian texts describe astronomical knowledge, suggesting observation of phenomena that shouldn't have been visible to the naked eye. Egyptian texts contain mathematical principles of remarkable sophistication. These texts are usually interpreted as mythological or speculative philosophy. But what if they were descriptions of actual technologies or observations? One possibility worth exploring: what if pre-catastrophe civilizations possessed energy systems fundamentally different from what we use today? Solar power, but captured and distributed in ways we haven't rediscovered. Understanding of geothermal energy. Methods of capturing electromagnetic energy. These aren't wild speculation, they're technologies that exist within known physics. If ancient peoples understood how to implement them, they would have written descriptions that look like mythology to us. Similarly, what if they possessed organizational technologies, ways of coordinating large populations, and preserving information that prevented the pathological concentration of power that leads to collapse? What if they understood psychological principles that allowed civilizations to remain stable at higher levels of complexity than we've achieved? What if the reason their knowledge was lost is not that it was impossible, but that it was difficult, and when catastrophe struck and society became focused on survival, the resources to maintain that knowledge disappeared? The implication would be profound. Solutions to our current challenges might already exist, documented in ancient texts, that we're only beginning to interpret accurately. The knowledge we need to build resilience and prevent collapse might not require brilliant innovation. It might require rediscovering what ancient peoples knew. This isn't an argument that we should abandon modern science and return to ancient methods. Rather, it's an argument for intellectual humility. We should acknowledge the gaps in our understanding. We should study ancient knowledge systems seriously, looking for genuine technological or organizational principles rather than dismissing them as superstition. We should consider the possibility that ancient peoples were not less intelligent than us, just differently focused. Their knowledge developed in response to different problems than the ones modern science has addressed. If this is true, then an enormous library of solved problems exists, preserved in ancient texts, monuments, and mythologies. The challenge is learning to read what was written. The ancients couldn't use our scientific language. They encoded knowledge into symbolism, architecture, mathematics embedded in proportions, and mythology. But the knowledge is there. waiting for enough of us to become sufficiently literate in ancient languages of encoding to understand what was actually preserved. If we accept that catastrophe is likely, and acknowledge that the current trajectory leads toward destabilization, the question becomes, what can actually be done? What interventions might build genuine resilience, rather than merely postponing inevitable collapse? The first element is information distribution. Centralized knowledge systems are vulnerable to catastrophic loss, but distributed systems persist even when individual nodes fail. Modern blockchain technology, for instance, creates permanent records that cannot be destroyed through conventional means because the information exists simultaneously on thousands of computers globally. Open source software follows similar principles. The code is freely available, copied extensively, making it nearly impossible to destroy. If crucial technical and scientific knowledge were distributed this way, it would survive even severe civilizational disruption. The second element is technological redundancy. Modern civilization optimizes for efficiency, just-in-time supply chains, specialized equipment, centralized infrastructure. This creates maximum productivity but minimum resilience. Building resilience requires intentionally building redundancy backup systems, low-tech alternatives, distributed capabilities, a society with renewable energy distributed across regions, local agricultural production, modular infrastructure, and backup systems for critical functions would be far more resilient than one optimized purely for growth. The third element involves low complexity but functional technologies. The most advanced technology is only useful if it can be maintained. Industrial civilization depends on incredibly complex supply chains. If those chains are disrupted, the technology fails. But technologies like bicycles, mechanical clocks, hand tools, and analog manufacturing systems can be maintained locally with minimal inputs. A civilization that maintained knowledge of these low-complexity technologies alongside advanced systems would retain functionality even if supply chains collapsed. Fourthly, community-based knowledge preservation. Not just formal education, but practical training in essential skills. Agricultural knowledge, basic medical care, water purification, structural repair. These skills disappear within one generation, if not actively transmitted through apprenticeship. Communities that maintain craft traditions and knowledge systems are far more resilient than those depending entirely on specialized institutions. Fifth, social structures that prevent concentrated power. Historically, this is perhaps the hardest element to implement, but it's also perhaps the most crucial. Centralized authority makes rapid decisions, but it also creates brittleness. Distributed decision-making is slower, but far more resilient. Governance systems, economic systems, and organizational structures that prevent the concentration of power would reduce the likelihood of catastrophic corruption and cascading failure. Sixth, ecological regeneration. This isn't mysticism, but practical restoration. Ecosystems that are healthy and biodiverse are more resilient than degraded ones. Forests, wetlands, and grasslands that are actively restored rather than exploited create the biological foundation for sustainable food production and climate stability. Some forward-thinking communities are already implementing this rewilding projects. Permaculture systems, regenerative agriculture. These systems are typically more labor-intensive than industrial agriculture, but they build long-term soil health and biodiversity rather than depleting both. The remarkable thing about these elements is that they're not scientifically impossible. We possess the knowledge and technological capability to implement all of them. The barriers are not technical, but institutional and political. Current economic systems incentivize efficiency over resilience. Corporations and governments benefit from centralization. The cultural assumption of continuous progress makes preparing for disruption seem pessimistic. But scattered across the world, communities are already implementing these principles. Eco-villages are experimenting with distributed renewable energy and local food production. Open-source communities are creating resilient information systems. Permaculture practitioners are demonstrating regenerative agriculture. Intentional communities are exploring distributed governance. These aren't fringe experiments, they're proofs of concept showing that alternatives are viable. What's required is not invention, but scaling. If sufficient communities adopted resilience-building principles, if enough people chose distributed systems over centralized ones, if sufficient resources flowed toward preservation and redundancy rather than pure efficiency, then civilizational resilience would increase substantially. Not to the point of guaranteed survival through catastrophe, but enough that the transition could be managed rather than chaotic. Here exists an uncomfortable reality that most institutions and most political movements avoid discussing. Whether catastrophe arrives in 50 years or 500 years, the sooner a civilization transitions towards sustainability and resilience, the better. This isn't an argument for panic or rushed action. Rather, it's an argument for intentional, deliberate transition implemented over decades. Consider the mathematics of the situation. If catastrophe becomes probable around the time our current cycle completes, potentially within 1,000 to 5,000 years, more likely within 500 years when shorter cycles are considered, then we have time to transition. But time is a depleting resource. Every year we delay, the transition becomes more compressed. Every year, complexity deepens and creates more potential for cascading failure. Imagine two scenarios. In the first, over the next 50 years, we deliberately transition global civilization toward distributed renewable energy, localized food production, redundant information systems, and governance structures that prevent catastrophic power concentration. This transition would be disruptive. Some people would experience loss. Current wealthy societies would voluntarily accept lower material consumption in exchange for greater stability. Powerful institutions would surrender centralized control. This sounds impossible because it requires overcoming massive institutional resistance. In the second scenario, transition is delayed. Current patterns continue for another 100 years. Complexity deepens. System fragility increases. Wealth inequality intensifies. Institutional rigidity increases. Then catastrophe strikes: military conflict, ecological collapse, pandemic, or cosmic event. The civilization tries to transition under emergency conditions. The transition is chaotic, causing massive disruption, suffering, and knowledge loss. If the civilization survives at all, it emerges into a much darker age than if transition had occurred gradually. The difference is between managed and catastrophic transition. Managed transition involves reducing material complexity, distributing power, and building redundancy voluntarily. Catastrophic transition involves the same outcome, but forced, destructive, and accompanied by enormous suffering. The irony is that managed transition might not actually require enormous sacrifice. Modern civilization produces vast waste. We could maintain comfortable standards of living while using far fewer resources. We could transition to renewable energy without experiencing dramatic reduction in comfort if transition occurred gradually. We could distribute knowledge and power without creating chaos if systems were built deliberately for this purpose. The barriers are psychological and institutional, not technical or resource-based. The barrier is that powerful interests resist transition because it threatens their power. The barrier is that psychological systems optimized for believing tomorrow resembles today prevent taking serious action. The barrier is that institutions are designed to preserve themselves rather than adapt. But barriers can be overcome if sufficient people recognize their existence and work toward change. Environmental movements, intentional communities, technology innovators, and consciousness evolution seekers are already building alternatives. The question is whether these alternatives can scale before catastrophe forces chaotic transition. What's clear is that waiting passively is not a viable strategy. The cycle is real. We're approaching a vulnerable window. Collapse is a genuine possibility. The choice before us is whether to acknowledge this and prepare, or to maintain normalcy bias until catastrophe forces recognition. Individually, this means making choices about knowledge preservation, community participation, technological adoption, and skill development. Collectively, it means pushing institutions toward building resilience and supporting leaders and organizations committed to managed transition. It means acknowledging that our current civilization is not permanent and that preparing for transition now is not pessimism, it's clarity. The moment for decision is not some distant future. It's now. Every choice made in this decade affects whether the next centuries see managed or catastrophic transition. This is what it means to be conscious of the cycle, recognizing that our current moment is crucial and that what we do now matters enormously. At the foundation of the cyclical pattern lies a question that science hasn't fully addressed. Why? Why does this pattern exist? Why are civilizations cyclical? Why does collapse occur at regular intervals? The conventional answers from history and geology are incomplete. They explain the mechanisms impact events trigger climate change, which destabilizes agriculture, which creates social collapse. True enough, but they don't explain why the pattern is so persistent or why it appears cyclical. One possibility worth considering is that the cycles represent something about consciousness itself. Human cognition developed in ancestral environments where our greatest threat was other humans and large predators. We evolved to be tribalistic, hierarchical, short-term focused, and prone to over-exploiting resources in competitive environments. These traits were adaptive in small groups competing for survival. They become pathological when amplified through complex civilization. Consider, in small groups, hierarchy serves coordination. In global civilization, the same hierarchical impulse creates crushing inequality. In tribal competition, short-term thinking serves survival. In complex civilization, the same short-term thinking creates long-term catastrophe. The psychological traits that made us successful in ancestral environments make us self-destructive in modern conditions. We're running ancient software on modern hardware, and the mismatch creates systemic dysfunction. If this diagnosis is accurate, then cycles might represent the process through which consciousness develops. Not that consciousness is literally evolving. Humans today are no more consciously aware than humans centuries ago. Rather, the collective consciousness expressed through civilization is developing, learning, becoming capable of longer-term thinking and more complex coordination. Each cycle might represent an attempt to achieve something new. Pre-catastrophe civilization attempted to build permanent, stable, technologically advanced society. That attempt failed. Modern civilization is attempting to create global civilization through technology and commerce. That attempt is also failing. The pattern of failure might be teaching each cycle's failure, teaching lessons that enable different approaches in subsequent cycles. From this perspective, collapse isn't tragedy, it's transformation. It's the mechanism through which consciousness evolves from tribalism to hierarchy to perhaps something more sophisticated. Each cycle represents a stage in development. The question is whether consciousness can develop fast enough to break the pattern before the next catastrophe, or whether development requires additional cycles through collapse. There's something poignant in this interpretation. It suggests that the billions who suffer through collapse the starvation, violence, displacement, death are participating in something beyond simple tragedy. Their suffering is the cost of consciousness evolution. Not that suffering is thereby justified or acceptable, but that it might serve a purpose beyond mere destruction. This might also explain why ancient peoples encoded knowledge into symbols and rituals and secret societies. If they understood that catastrophe was part of consciousness evolution, that cycles were inevitable, then their task wasn't to prevent cycles. Their task was to preserve what consciousness had learned, so that subsequent cycles could build on previous knowledge, rather than starting from complete zero. This interpretation also provides a possible answer to the question of whether our cycle can be broken. Perhaps consciousness is finally developing the sophistication to manage complex systems, without the pathological behaviors that cause collapse. Perhaps our unique position having access to global information, understanding systems deeply, recognizing the patterns might mean we're the first iteration of civilization capable of conscious, deliberate stability without requiring catastrophic reset. Or perhaps consciousness still requires cycles. Perhaps 1 or 2 or 10 more cycles are necessary before consciousness develops sufficiently to sustain permanent complexity. We don't know. But the possibility that cycles serve consciousness evolution gives meaning to what otherwise appears as mere tragedy. It suggests that catastrophe, while terrible, might also be creative, destructive, and generative at once. Move away from human-centric interpretation and look at the cosmos itself. What becomes apparent is that periodicity and cycles are not anomalies in the universe. They're fundamental. Atoms vibrate at specific frequencies. Planets orbit in regular patterns. Galaxies rotate with predictable periodicity. Pulsars emit radiation in precise rhythms. The universe appears to be built on harmonic principles. Everything that exists oscillates at some frequency or follows some cycle. From this perspective, the 12,000-year cycle affecting human civilization isn't aberrant. It would actually be more surprising if civilizations didn't experience cycles. It would suggest that human systems operated outside the principles that govern the rest of the cosmos. The fact that civilizations rise and fall in cycles suggests that human civilization participates in the same harmonic principles that organize everything else in existence. This connects to an ancient insight present in multiple traditions. The universe operates through cycles within cycles. Hindu cosmology describes this explicitly: yugas within kalpas, shorter cycles nested within longer cycles, all vibrating at different frequencies. Chinese philosophy emphasizes cycles of yin and yang, of seasons and ages. Western mysticism speaks of correspondences between microcosm and macrocosm, the principles operating in atoms, operating also in galaxies. Modern physics has vindicated these ancient intuitions. We've discovered that the universe appears to be fractal patterns at one scale repeat at other scales. A lightning bolt's pattern resembles a river's branching. A galaxy's spiral resembles a spiral nebula or the pattern of a hurricane. DNA's helical pattern appears at the scale of galaxies. This suggests that fundamental organizational principles repeat across scales. If this is true cosmologically, it would be expected that human civilization operates according to the same principles. We should expect cycles, we should expect patterns. We should expect that the principles organizing atoms and galaxies also organize societies and civilizations. But here's what's fascinating. These principles aren't deterministic. They describe patterns, but not rigid, predetermined paths. A cycle can run to completion, or it can be interrupted. A pattern can be expressed in infinite variations. The harmonic principles underlying the universe create constraints, but not certainties. This relates to a more radical possibility, that consciousness and cosmos might be fundamentally linked. Not in a mystical sense, but in terms of information. The universe appears to be fundamentally informational. Physical laws are mathematical patterns, which are information. Consciousness is also information processing. What if consciousness and cosmos are different expressions of the same underlying information system? What if the universe doesn't just contain consciousness, but is, in some sense, learning about itself through conscious beings? From this perspective, civilizational cycles would represent the universe's consciousness learning. Each cycle would be the universe experimenting with different social arrangements, technologies, and organizational principles. Collapse would be the universe rejecting failed experiments. Rebuild would be the universe trying new approaches. Over many cycles, more sophisticated solutions emerge. This might sound poetic rather than scientific, but it's actually consistent with how science understands complexity. Complex systems self-organize. They develop emergent properties not present in individual components. They learn through trial and error. Biological evolution operates through cycles of variation and selection. Perhaps civilizational cycles operate similarly. Variations in social organization are selected for or against by interaction with environmental and cosmic constraints. If this is accurate, then our civilization is not unique or special in the cosmos. It's a typical iteration of consciousness learning how to organize complex systems. Our choices matter not because they affect some grand cosmic destiny, but because they're part of the ongoing learning process. Our success or failure becomes data in the universe's larger learning curve. This might seem humbling, suggesting that our civilization is not central to everything, but it's also potentially liberating. It means that catastrophe is not the end of everything. It's part of a process. Life continues, consciousness continues, learning continues. We're not custodians of the only consciousness in the universe. We're participants in consciousness, learning how to express itself through increasingly complex forms. If cycles are real, if catastrophe is likely, if collapse is part of the pattern, what meaning can be derived from this? How should we live knowing that our civilization is temporary, that our efforts will likely be erased, that what we build will probably be destroyed? The answer that emerges from examining history and meaning is unexpected. Impermanence doesn't negate meaning. Some of the most meaningful human endeavors are explicitly temporary. A sunset is meaningful precisely because it doesn't last. A piece of music is meaningful as it unfolds and then ends. A conversation is meaningful even though it ceases. A relationship is meaningful even though it will eventually end. A life is meaningful even though it lasts merely decades, in a universe billions of years old. The assumption that meaning requires permanence is actually a modern assumption. Ancient peoples lived in constant awareness that life was temporary, that civilizations would eventually fall, that empires would eventually crumble. This didn't negate meaning for them, it intensified it. Every moment mattered because moments were finite. Every contribution to human knowledge and culture mattered because it could be lost, and preventing that loss required conscious effort. What this means for us is that we don't need guarantees of permanence to live meaningfully. We can build systems knowing they might fail. We can create art knowing it might be destroyed. We can advance knowledge knowing that future civilizations might not remember our contributions. The act of creating, of building, of attempting this has intrinsic meaning, independent of whether the result lasts forever. Additionally, impermanence at one level doesn't negate continuity at another. Our individual civilization might collapse, but the learning that our civilization generates persists. If we encode it into symbols and stories and structures and mathematical principles, if we distribute it across multiple forms and formats, then even if our civilization falls, future civilizations could rediscover what we learned. Not everything would be lost. Some knowledge would persist. Some learning would be preserved. This is perhaps the most meaningful way to understand the role of preservation and resilience building. Not as an attempt to prevent the inevitable, but as an attempt to ensure that when collapse occurs, it's not total. That survivors have access to crucial knowledge that allows rebuilding to happen faster. That the consciousness and learning of our civilization doesn't die completely, but persists in accessible form for future people to discover. This shifts the meaning of our present actions. It's not about preventing catastrophe. That's probably not possible. It's about building in such a way that what we create survives catastrophe. It's about ensuring that future consciousness can build on what we've learned, rather than starting from absolute scratch. Individually, this means making choices about knowledge acquisition, skills development, and community participation that persist across disruption. It means considering not just immediate benefit, but long-term survival value. It means sometimes choosing resilience over growth, distribution over efficiency, redundancy over elegance. Collectively, it means shifting the goal of civilization from perpetual growth to sustainable continuity. Not about preventing all change that's impossible and undesirable, but about changing in ways that preserve what's valuable while releasing what's destructive. Most importantly, it means living with clear eyes about reality while choosing meaning anyway. Accepting that catastrophe is likely while building systems of resilience. Acknowledging that our civilization is temporary while investing deeply in creating meaningful contributions. This is not pessimism, it's wisdom. And wisdom is what becomes most precious when times grow dark. Let's return to where we began, the mystery of missing history, the gaps in the official narrative. The sense that something fundamental about how civilization actually works has been hidden or forgotten. With everything we've explored, that mystery now has the shape of an answer. The gaps in history are real because civilization is cyclical. Civilizations rise and fall at regular intervals. Knowledge is preserved through catastrophe, but not perfectly. Information is lost, fragmented, embedded into symbols that take centuries to decode. When new civilizations rebuild, they don't inherit complete understanding of the previous world. They inherit fragments, encoded into mythology and ritual and architectural principles. The sophisticated technologies that appeared seemingly overnight in ancient civilizations weren't invented from nothing. They were reintroduced by survivors and knowledge keepers who possessed partial understanding from before. The simultaneous emergence of agriculture and mathematics and writing across isolated cultures wasn't coincidence. It was implementation of a blueprint, preserved and transmitted. The mysterious collapses of advanced civilizations, the Bronze Age collapse, The fall of Egypt's Old Kingdom, the abandonment of Mayan cities, these weren't random tragedies. They were points in a cycle. They occurred when civilizations became brittle, when power concentrated excessively, when environmental stress increased, and when external triggers provided the final push toward cascade failure. The astronomical knowledge, embedded into ancient monuments and mythology, wasn't mystical superstition. It was survival technology. Astronomers tracking cycles were attempting to predict when the next catastrophe might arrive. They were building systems designed to preserve this knowledge across generations and civilizations. The psychological patterns visible in cultures that survived collapsed the emphasis on cyclical time. The resistance to rapid change, the deep integration of knowledge into ritual and mythology weren't primitive superstition. They were adaptive responses to having experienced catastrophe. They were technologies for maintaining psychological stability and knowledge preservation through disruption. Everything connects. The pattern visible in geology connects to the pattern visible in history. The pattern visible in history connects to the psychological patterns visible in surviving cultures. The psychological patterns connect to the astronomical knowledge encoded into monuments. The monuments connect to the mythologies. The mythologies connect to the secret societies and knowledge preservation networks. All of it fits. All of it makes sense when you see it as a coherent pattern. This isn't to say we've explained everything. Profound mysteries remain. We don't fully understand how knowledge was preserved through catastrophe. We don't completely understand the mechanisms creating the cycles. We can't predict precisely when the next transition will occur. There remain genuine mysteries, genuine gaps in our understanding. But those remaining mysteries are different from the gaps we began with. The original gaps felt like hidden knowledge, like information that was being deliberately obscured. The remaining mysteries feel different. They feel like genuine unknowns, questions we haven't yet developed adequate frameworks to answer. The difference is crucial. One inspires distrust. The other inspires curiosity and humility. We've connected the threads. History now appears not as random events, but as a pattern. Civilization appears not as linear progress, but as spiral ascending and descending, cycling through phases, returning to similar situations at regular intervals. We're not the first to experience what we're experiencing. Others have stood where we stand, possessing knowledge of cycles, facing critical choices about how to respond. Some of them created systems designed to survive collapse. Some encoded knowledge into symbols and stories. Some built institutions meant to preserve understanding across the darkness. They did this not because they were guaranteed success, but because the attempt was meaningful. Because trying to preserve knowledge and wisdom mattered, even if success wasn't guaranteed. We inherit their attempt. We possess their encoded knowledge, partially understood. We stand at a similar juncture. We possess awareness of the cycles they possessed, plus additional knowledge from our modern scientific perspective. We have tools they didn't have: technology for distributing information, understanding of complexity systems, mathematical models of collapse. We also face challenges they didn't face. Our complexity is deeper, our interconnectedness is greater, our weapons are more destructive. The threads are connected, the pattern is visible. Now the question becomes, what do we do with this knowledge? There's a theory in quantum physics called the observer effect. The act of measurement affects the thing being measured. The universe appears to behave differently when observed than when unobserved. What seems like abstract physics connects to something profoundly human. Awareness matters. Consciousness affects reality. Before awareness, we're unconscious participants in patterns. We repeat behaviors because that's how things are done. We make individual choices that collectively produce systemic outcomes we didn't intend. We accelerate toward collapse because the structure of institutions prevents coordinated response to the warning signs we collectively ignore. After awareness, something shifts. Not magically, awareness alone doesn't solve problems. But the possibility space changes. With awareness, we can make conscious choices about whether to continue repeating patterns or attempt alternatives. We can coordinate responses that weren't possible when the pattern was invisible. We can see leverage points where small changes might prevent large cascades. Consider an individual becoming aware of a personal trauma pattern. Before awareness, the person repeats the pattern unconsciously, wondering why the same problems keep occurring. After awareness, the pattern can be changed. Not easily. Awareness doesn't erase the pattern instantly, but possibility emerges. Choice becomes available. The same pattern that seemed inevitable becomes changeable. The same principle applies to civilizations. Before civilizational awareness of cycles, collapse appears to be fate. It happens to us, external forces beyond our control, internal dynamics we don't understand. After awareness, collapse becomes something we can potentially influence. Not prevent completely, perhaps, but mitigate, prepare for, manage consciously rather than experience as catastrophic surprise. This is why the documentation and preservation of this knowledge is so crucial. If the awareness remains isolated in a few individuals or small communities, it has limited effect. But if awareness spreads, if sufficient portions of populations recognize the patterns, understand the cycles, and coordinate around building resilience, then the pattern can shift. History provides evidence of this. Movements toward abolishing slavery began when sufficient people became aware that slavery, though normalized, was morally indefensible. Environmental movements began when sufficient people became aware that unlimited growth on a finite planet was impossible. Women's suffrage movements succeeded when sufficient people became aware that political systems, excluding half the population, were unjust. Awareness, when it reaches critical mass, transforms what seemed inevitable into changeable. The difference with the cycle awareness is that it's fundamental. It's not about one particular institution or practice. It's about the underlying pattern that governs how civilizations actually work. If sufficient people understand that pattern, that civilizations are cyclical and collapse is likely, and that conscious choices can affect how the transition occurs, then the entire framework of civilization changes. Not overnight, not without resistance. Institutions will resist change that threatens their power. Psychological denial will persist, but the possibility opens. Cracks form in the edifice. New approaches become visible. The momentum toward continued replication of the pattern isn't absolute anymore. This is why speaking about this now matters. Not because speaking about cycles will prevent collapse, it won't, but because awareness spreading through a population changes what's possible. If you understand the pattern, you can prepare. If you prepare, you're more resilient. If you're more resilient, you're more likely to survive disruption. If survivors are educated, prepared, and intentional rather than traumatized and desperate, they can rebuild more wisely. The awareness itself becomes a technology of survival. Not technology in the mechanical sense, but technology in the sense of a systematized method for achieving desired outcomes. The desired outcome being conscious transition rather than catastrophic collapse, managed resilience rather than chaotic disruption. This is possible because we can see, we have access to knowledge, we can recognize patterns, we can choose consciously. That capability, the mere capability, changes everything. But here's where intention meets reality. Information consumed isn't information acted upon. A documentary watched is not the same as a choice made. Understanding patterns intellectually is not the same as building systems aligned with that understanding. The gap between knowing and doing is perhaps the most important gap in human experience. So, this isn't just documentation of patterns. This is an invitation to move from passive awareness to active participation in what comes next. That participation can take many forms. At the individual level, it means making choices informed by genuine understanding rather than by institutional default. It means acquiring knowledge and skills that persist across disruption. It means not deferring your education to institutions that might not survive, but becoming actively engaged in learning that goes beyond what schools teach. It means considering your career and life choices through the lens of resilience rather than just income. It means building community connections with people who understand and share these perspectives. At the community level, participation means supporting local projects that build resilience, gardens that produce food locally, energy systems that don't depend on distant supply chains, information networks that remain functional even if centralized systems fail, educational initiatives that preserve crucial knowledge, organizations working toward more equitable power distribution. These communities exist, they're building alternatives, Support of them through participation, resources, and spreading awareness strengthens them. At the cultural level, participation means spreading awareness. It means having conversations about what you've learned. It means creating art, writing, media exploring these themes. It means shifting narratives from inevitable progress toward acknowledgement of cycles and possibility of resilience. It means teaching children not just conventional history, but awareness of patterns. It means asking different questions in educational institutions. Why do we assume progress is linear? Why don't we study collapse cycles? Why don't we teach systems thinking and complexity? At the institutional level, participation is more difficult because institutions resist change. But it's not impossible. Governance institutions can be pushed toward longer-term thinking. Economic systems can be modified to incentivize resilience and conservation. Educational systems can shift toward knowledge preservation and systems literacy. Scientific institutions can prioritize research into collapse mechanisms and resilience building. Religious institutions can recover and emphasize their traditional roles in knowledge preservation and consciousness development. None of this is guaranteed to work. None of it will prevent all problems or ensure survival through catastrophe. But all of it matters. All of it represents conscious choice to build differently than we've been building. All of it represents participation in shaping what comes next, rather than passively accepting whatever patterns continue. The most important recognition is this: the pattern continues or changes based on decisions made by millions of people, made daily, made in small choices and large ones. The system doesn't change because one person changes. It changes because enough people change that the collective pattern shifts. You're not responsible for everything, but you're responsible for your choices and your participation. And your choices matter because others are making similar choices, and collectively, those choices create momentum toward different futures. This documentary is one node in a growing network of people recognizing the pattern. You're one node in that network now. What you do with this knowledge, that's your participation. That's your part in the awakening that's happening around the world. As more and more people recognize what's actually happening and choose consciously how to respond. The moment for this awakening is now. The window for managed transition is still open, but it's narrowing. Every year that passes, every choice made or unmade, affects whether future transition is conscious or catastrophic. This isn't meant to create panic. It's meant to create clarity and motivation. You're not helpless in facing what's coming. You're not passive witnesses to inevitable collapse. You're participants in determining what form the transition takes. That's the invitation. That's the call. The cycle continues whether we participate consciously or not. But consciousness matters. Awareness changes possibilities. Choice changes outcomes. You're invited to participate in that change,